History is often presented to us as a straight line, clear dates, famous names, decisive moments neatly arranged in textbooks. But what if that version of history is only a surface layer? What if, beneath the familiar stories, there exists another past, one shaped by silence, omission, and choices about what was worth remembering? Welcome. Today's story begins with a simple but unsettling idea. Much of the history we think we know is incomplete. Not because facts are missing, but because certain perspectives were never included in the first place. Over time, repetition turns selective memory into accepted truth. When history is taught, it is often compressed. Complex events are reduced to outcomes. Long struggles are summarized by short victories. Ordinary lives, the majority of humanity, fade into the background, while leaders, wars, and borders take center stage. This does not make the narrative false, but makes it narrow. Every society decides, consciously or not, which stories are passed down. Some narratives are highlighted because they reinforce stability, identity, or progress. Others quietly disappear because they complicate the picture, raise uncomfortable questions, or challenge established beliefs. Over generations, absence becomes normal. Silence becomes invisible. This series is not about rewriting history or rejecting what we already know. It is about slowing down and looking sideways at the overlooked details, the unnamed contributors, and the experiences that shape daily life but rarely entered official records. These stories do not always come with clear heroes or dramatic endings. Often they are subtle, unresolved, and deeply human. As we move forward today, we are not searching for secrets or shock. We are searching for context, for the spaces between the lines, for the understanding that history is not only made by those remembered, but also by those forgotten. This is the history we were never taught, and this is where our journey begins. History does not shape itself. It is selected, organized, and repeated through systems designed by people with specific priorities. Textbooks, museums, national holidays, and classrooms do more than preserve the past, they filter it. Over time, this filtering becomes so familiar that it feels neutral, even natural. What survives in official history is often what serves a purpose. Governments emphasize narratives that support unity, legitimacy, or progress. Institutions favor stories that are easy to measure, celebrate, or conclude. Events with clear beginnings and endings are easier to teach than slow transformations, unresolved struggles, or everyday survival. As a result, complexity is softened and contradiction is trimmed away. This process does not always require bad intentions. Many omissions happen quietly, through practical limits. There is only so much time in a school year. Only so many pages in a textbook. Choices must be made. But those choices accumulate. When the same perspectives are repeatedly prioritized, they begin to define what is considered important history. Voices without political power, written records, or social status are the easiest to exclude. Farmers, laborers, women, children, displaced communities, and minority groups often appear only as background conditions rather than active participants. Their experiences are treated as context, not content. Yet these lives formed the foundation on which major events unfolded. Over generations, this imbalance shapes how societies understand themselves. Success is attributed to a few visible figures, while collective effort fades from view. Struggle is remembered only when it leads to victory, not when it continues quietly or ends without recognition. The past becomes cleaner, simpler, and more reassuring than it truly was. Understanding this process is essential, not to assign blame, but to recognize that history is a constructed narrative. Once that construction becomes visible, it becomes possible to question it and to listen more carefully to what was left out. For most of human history, the majority of people did not leave behind written traces. Their days were shaped by routine rather than revolution, by survival rather than legacy. They worked, adapted, raised families, endured change, and passed on knowledge informally. Yet these lives rarely appear in official records, not because they lacked significance, but because they lacked documentation. History favors what can be preserved. Laws, treaties, speeches, and monuments survive because they are deliberately recorded. Daily labor, emotional resilience, and informal systems of care do not translate easily into archives. As a result, the rhythm of ordinary life becomes almost invisible when the past is reconstructed. This absence creates a distorted sense of scale. Major events appear sudden and decisive, disconnected from slow pressures that made them possible. Wars seem to erupt without warning. Social change looks like a moment rather than a process. In reality, these shifts were built on countless small adjustments made by ordinary people responding to conditions around them. When everyday experiences are excluded, history becomes top-heavy. It centers power rather than participation, explains what happened but not how it was lived. The emotional cost of change, the uncertainty of transition, and the quiet strategies people use to cope are lost. Without these details, the past feels distant and abstract. Yet traces remain. In tools worn smooth by repeated use. In recipes passed down without authors. In oral traditions, customs, and local practices that survive long after their origins are forgotten. These fragments suggest a different kind of historical evidence, one that values continuity over climax. Recognizing the absence of ordinary lives does not weaken history. It deepens it. It reminds us that the past was not experienced as a timeline, but as a present moment, lived without knowing the outcome. By paying attention to what was never recorded, history becomes less about spectacle and more about humanity. Silence in history is rarely accidental. When certain stories are left out once, they can be left out again with little resistance. Over time, absence becomes familiar, and familiarity turns into tradition. What is not mentioned stops feeling missing. Educational systems play a key role in this process. Each generation learns from materials shaped by the one before it. If a topic is excluded early on, later versions often follow the same structure, assuming the omission is intentional or unimportant. Eventually, no one remembers a time when the story was told differently. This repetition creates a powerful effect. Gaps in knowledge are inherited rather than questioned. Students grow into adults who pass on the same simplified narratives, not because they agree with them, but because alternatives were never presented. Silence becomes self-sustaining. Cultural memory reinforces this pattern. Films, literature, and public commemorations tend to echo official versions of the past. They reward familiarity and clarity, avoiding ambiguity. Stories that do not fit established frameworks struggle to find an audience. As a result, certain perspectives remain marginalized even when evidence exists. Once silence is normalized, challenging it can feel disruptive. Questioning what is missing is sometimes mistaken for questioning the past itself. This discourages deeper inquiry and frames curiosity as unnecessary conflict. The past becomes something to accept, not explore. Yet tradition built on silence is fragile. It relies on consistency rather than accuracy. As new sources emerge and old assumptions are revisited, the gaps become harder to ignore. What was once absent begins to stand out. Understanding how silence turns into tradition helps explain why some histories feel fixed and unchangeable. It also reveals that these narratives were shaped by habit, not inevitability. And habits, once recognized, can be re-examined. Historical narratives often emphasize progress as a sequence of achievements. New technologies appear, systems improve, living standards rise, and societies move forward. While these developments are real, they are frequently presented without the conditions that made them possible or the costs that accompanied them. When progress is isolated from context, it becomes abstract. Innovations seem inevitable rather than contested. Change appears smooth rather than disruptive. The focus shifts to outcomes, while the uneven experiences beneath them fade away. Not everyone benefits at the same pace, and not everyone agrees on what progress means. Many advancements were built on forms of sacrifice that are rarely discussed. Long working hours, unsafe conditions, environmental strain, and social displacement often formed the invisible foundation of improvement. These realities complicate celebratory narratives, so they are often reduced to footnotes or removed entirely. Without context, progress is also disconnected from resistance. Opposition is framed as ignorance or fear rather than a response to real disruption. Communities that struggled to adapt are remembered as obstacles instead of participants navigating uncertainty. Their hesitation is judged by outcomes they could not foresee. This framing shapes modern expectations. It encourages the belief that advancement always justifies discomfort and that questioning change is unnecessary or backward. History becomes a story of winners moving forward rather than societies negotiating difficult transitions. Restoring context does not deny progress. It makes it honest. It acknowledges that improvement is rarely clean. and that its effects are distributed unevenly. By understanding how progress was lived, not just achieved, the past becomes a source of insight rather than reassurance. History is often treated as a neutral account of what happened. In practice, it has frequently been used as a tool to justify decisions in the present. Narratives of the past can legitimize authority, define identity, and shape what a society believes is possible or acceptable. By emphasizing certain moments and minimizing others, historical storytelling can frame power as natural or earned. Success appears predetermined. Inequality looks inherited rather than constructed. When these patterns are repeated often enough, they stop being questioned. Selective memory is especially effective when it feels distant. Events framed as long ago are presented as disconnected from modern life, even when their consequences remain visible. This creates the impression that current systems emerged organically without deliberate choices or alternatives. History has also been used to draw boundaries between groups, cultures, and nations. Simplified stories of origin and conflict can strengthen collective identity, but they can also flatten complexity. Cooperation fades, tension is emphasized, and long periods of coexistence are overlooked. When history functions this way, it becomes prescriptive rather than descriptive. It suggests not only what happened, but what should be accepted. The past turns into a quiet argument for the present. Recognizing this use of history does not require rejecting it. It requires awareness. Once history is seen as a narrative shaped by intention, it can be examined with greater care. Facts remain important, but so do framing, emphasis, and omission. Understanding history as a tool helps explain why some stories are protected and others resisted. It also opens space to ask a different question, not just what happened, but why this version of the past continues to be told. A simplified version of history is easier to teach and easier to remember, but it comes with consequences. When complexity is removed, the past becomes less demanding. It no longer asks difficult questions or challenges comfortable assumptions. Instead, it offers clarity at the expense of understanding. Simplification often reduces events to moral lessons with clear roles. Right and wrong are neatly assigned. Causes and effects appear obvious. While this structure is appealing, it discourages deeper analysis. Ambiguity, uncertainty, and contradiction are treated as distractions rather than essential elements of reality. This approach also narrows empathy. When historical actors are presented as symbols rather than people, their motivations are flattened. Struggles are either glorified or dismissed, leaving little room to understand fear, hesitation, or compromise. The past becomes populated by caricatures instead of human beings. Over time, this affects how people interpret the present. Complex issues are approached with the expectation of simple answers. Disagreement feels like error rather than perspective. History stops being a source of insight and becomes a collection of conclusions. A simplified past also limits imagination. If change is remembered as sudden and decisive, gradual effort seems insignificant. If progress is framed as inevitable, responsibility fades. The role of choice, chance, and persistence becomes harder to see. Restoring complexity does not make history weaker. It makes it useful. It allows the past to function as a space for reflection rather than instruction. By accepting that history was lived in uncertainty, the present becomes easier to navigate with patience and humility. When collective memory is narrowed, loss occurs quietly. Not only of facts, but of understanding. A limited version of the past reduces the range of experiences we can learn from, and with it, the range of responses we imagine for the present. Memory shapes perception. If only certain paths are remembered, they begin to look like the only paths that ever existed. Alternatives fade, along with the people who pursued them. Experiments that failed, compromises that held communities together, and solutions that worked only temporarily are often excluded. Yet these moments reveal how societies adapt under pressure. Narrow memory also weakens connection across time. When the past is presented as fundamentally different from the present, empathy thins. People from earlier periods appear either primitive or heroic, but rarely familiar. Their concerns feel unrelated, even when they echo modern anxieties about work, belonging, or stability. This distance affects responsibility. If the past is simplified into inevitability, present conditions feel detached from historical choices. Consequences appear abstract. Continuities are overlooked. Memory becomes a closed archive instead of a living reference. There is also a creative loss. Stories shape imagination. When memory includes only dominant narratives, cultural expression follows the same patterns. Art, discussion, and education repeat familiar frames. The space for reinterpretation shrinks. Expanding memory does not mean remembering everything equally. It means acknowledging that what is remembered influences what can be thought. A broader memory invites comparison, humility, and flexibility. It allows the past to inform rather than instruct. By widening the frame of memory, history regains its depth. It stops being a fixed backdrop and becomes a conversation, one that continues to shape how societies understand themselves and the possibilities ahead. When history is incomplete, understanding requires a different kind of attention. Instead of focusing only on what is stated, it becomes necessary to notice patterns, gaps, and contradictions. These spaces between the lines often reveal more than the text itself. Silence can point to pressure. Sudden changes in law may suggest long-standing conflict. Repeated reforms hint at unresolved problems. When certain groups appear only at moments of crisis, it implies a presence that existed long before it was acknowledged. Absence, in this sense, becomes evidence. Interpreting history this way requires patience. It means resisting quick conclusions and accepting uncertainty. Not every question has a clear answer, and not every gap can be filled. But the process of asking changes the relationship with the past. Sources take on new meaning when viewed in context. A census reflects who was counted and who was ignored. A map shows priorities as much as geography. Even language choices reveal assumptions about value and importance. Reading carefully exposes the framework behind the facts. This approach shifts history from memorization to interpretation. The past becomes less authoritative and more conversational. It invites participation rather than acceptance. Understanding grows through comparison, not repetition. Reading between the lines also challenges hierarchy. It treats minor details as meaningful and resists the idea that only major events deserve attention. In doing so, it restores a sense of scale and proportion. This way of engaging with history does not produce certainty. It produces awareness. And awareness allows the past to function as a guide, not by offering answers, but by sharpening the questions we ask in present. The stories left out of history do not stay in the past. Their absence continues to shape how societies explain inequality, success, and responsibility. When certain experiences are ignored, the systems built upon them appear natural rather than historical. Present conditions often feel detached from their origins. Economic gaps, social divisions, and cultural tensions are treated as recent developments or individual failures. Without historical context, patterns lose their depth. Causes are simplified. Solutions become superficial. Understanding overlooked histories reconnects cause and consequence. It shows that many modern structures evolved through gradual decisions, not sudden events. What seems permanent was once contested. What appears fixed was shaped by choices that could have been different. These stories also affect belonging. When people do not see themselves reflected in the past, history feels like something that happened to others. This distance weakens engagement and responsibility. A shared past becomes harder to imagine. Remembering more fully does not mean reopening old conflicts. It means recognizing continuity. The past explains not only where societies came from, but how they learned to think in certain ways. It reveals habits of judgment, inclusion, and exclusion that persist quietly. When history includes more voices, it becomes less about authority and more about understanding. It encourages reflection rather than defense. The past stops being a closed narrative and becomes a resource. These stories matter because they influence what feels possible. They expand the range of futures that can be imagined. By acknowledging what was forgotten, history regains its relevance not as instruction, but as context for choice. A fuller view of history does not offer comfort in the form of clear conclusions. Instead, it introduces uncertainty. Causes overlap. Motives conflict. Outcomes remain unresolved. This can feel unsettling, especially when history is expected to provide clarity or direction. Uncertainty, however, reflects how the past was actually lived. People made decisions without knowing the results. They acted with limited information, under pressure, and often with competing priorities. Recognizing this restores realism to historical understanding. When uncertainty is accepted, judgment softens. Actions are examined within context rather than measured against outcomes alone. Success and failure lose their absolute meaning. What remains is processed the series of choices, constraints, and adaptations that shaped events. This perspective also changes how lessons are drawn. Instead of extracting simple morals, history becomes a space for comparison. Patterns are observed, not prescribed. Insight emerges through reflection rather than instruction. Sitting with uncertainty builds intellectual patience. It resists the urge to resolve complexity too quickly. It allows multiple interpretations to exist without forcing consensus. This does not weaken understanding. It strengthens it by making room for nuance. In a world that often demands immediate answers, this approach feels slow, but it mirrors the pace of real change. It acknowledges that understanding develops over time through revision and reconsideration. By allowing uncertainty, history becomes less about control and more about awareness. It prepares the present not by predicting outcomes, but by cultivating attention to complexity, limits, and possibility. Relearning history does not begin with replacing one narrative with another. It begins with changing how attention is directed. Instead of asking only what happened, the question shifts toward how stories were formed, repeated, and preserved. This approach treats history as layered rather than linear. Different experiences coexist within the same moment. What is remembered depends on position, access, and power. A single event can hold multiple truths without canceling any of them. Looking at the past this way encourages care. It slows interpretation and resists certainty. It values small details alongside major events, recognizing that both shape understanding. The past becomes less like a finished product and more like an ongoing process of interpretation. Relearning also requires humility. It accepts that no account is complete and that understanding can change as new perspectives emerge. This does not weaken historical knowledge. It keeps it alive. When attention widens, forgotten stories do not replace familiar ones. They sit beside them, adding depth and tension. History becomes less reassuring but more honest. This shift in perspective has a quiet effect. It changes how questions are asked, how disagreements are held, and how responsibility is understood. The past stops being something inherited unquestioned and becomes something engaged with deliberately. In relearning how to look at history, the goal is not mastery. It is awareness. And in that awareness, history regains its power not to instruct, but to inform how the present is understood and how the future is approached. As we step back from everything explored in this journey, one idea becomes clear. History is not just a collection of events we inherit. It is a way of seeing shaped by repetition, omission, and habit. What we remember influences how we explain the present and imagine the future. The history we were never taught is not hidden in secret archives or dramatic revelations. It exists in the ordinary, the unresolved, and the overlooked. In the lives that left few records, in the silences that felt normal, in the assumptions that went unexamined for generations. Looking at the past more carefully does not demand certainty. It asks for attention. It invites us to notice complexity, to accept uncertainty, and to understand that no single story can fully contain human experience. When history is approached this way, it becomes less about answers and more about awareness. This series was not meant to challenge facts, but to widen perspective. Not to replace familiar narratives, but to place them within a broader frame. A frame where memory is incomplete, progress is uneven, and meaning is shaped over time. If there's one thing to take forward, it is this: the past is not finished speaking. It continues through structures, habits, and assumptions that shape daily life. Listening more closely does not change what happened, but it changes how we understand where we stand now. Thank you for spending this time, reflecting on history from a quieter angle. If you found value in this way of looking at the past, feel free to stay, listen, and continue the journey in future stories. Until next time.